Welcome to the Artistic Spirit podcast. Today I'm with L.R.J. Allen, who is the author of slasher horror Summerside Lake Massacre, as well as short story compilation, among other things, and suspense novella Office Politics. His latest horror story is available titled A Violent Encounter. He is an avid fan of the fantastic and has been addicted to popular fiction from a young age. He worked 8 years in local government and 3 in telecoms before turning his hand to writing. He lives just outside of Salisbury with his wife, Charlotte, and their cat, Bella. Welcome.
Thank you, Katie. I appreciate you having me on.
So you mentioned that you started writing at 18, but didn't begin writing properly until your mid-late 20s. What was the turning point or motivation that pushed you to take your writing more seriously? And what advice can you give to someone who might be on the fence about taking their writing more seriously?
That's a very good question. In terms of the motivation to finally start writing, I thought I'd give it a go in my late teens, and the first story I ever wrote was one that's actually in, among other things, it's got a cheery title. It's called As I Lay Dying, and it was more just kind of like an exercise. I always, like when I was at school, quite liked it when you went into an English class and they just said, right, our lesson today is just write whatever the hell you want. But at the same time, it was never something that I was overly passionate about. But it wasn't until, like, I wasn't that avid I would read. I mean, that sounds awful, but I'd go through spits and starts. So I would read a lot, and then I'd have a break where I wouldn't read anything, and then so on and so forth. But then around the time I read, around the time I wrote that first short story, it kind of created a bit of a spark, but life basically just got in the way. I and you know, like I have a lot of self doubt. So especially when I was younger, there was a lot of like, oh, I don't know whether this is going to be good enough. I don't know whether people are going to like it. And it wasn't until I'd reached kind of my mid-20s that an ex of mine bought me the book On Writing by Stephen King. And I'm an avid reader of Stephen King, but I never really, for whatever reason, I didn't get around to reading that one. And there was something that he wrote in it that just said, if you want to be a writer, you've got to read a lot and you've got to write a lot. And I thought, all right, I'll do that. And then when I started kind of like saying, okay, well, I've got these ideas, maybe I should just put them into certain short stories, I just found I quite enjoyed it. And then, yeah, it was kind of like I would do it through like lunch breaks, or I would just go, oh, okay, I fancy writing today. But it wasn't actually until just before I left my telecoms job that we had a drought in work, and so I just spent my spare time. I was allowed to. I did ask permission, but we had a drought at work, and I decided to just blaze on with it. And at the end of it, I had a collection of short stories. But it wasn't until the pandemic hit that I sat there and seriously considered publishing it. So I've been writing all this time, but it was only as the pandemic hit, I thought, what have I got to lose?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not expecting to suddenly become a very successful writer on the basis of a self-published series of shorts. But I figured I've got all of these. Why not let it go? And then there was, people seemed to quite like that. So I wrote something else, and then people seemed to quite like that. So then after I wrote the first novel, I felt like I got a bit of a bug for it. So yeah, it's just something I really enjoy doing.
How did you overcome the self-doubt?
I just did it. I think that's going to be a killer for anybody that that does anything creative. Is an element of self doubt. And oddly enough, it was something that something that you had done when doing one of the Twitter Spaces, and I think it was you'd mentioned, like, even if you've got that one person, do it for an audience of one, or something along those lines. And that, I think, is a great thing to be saying for someone who's got self-doubt. If you have one fan, then that fan is going to want to see something else that you've done. So I think that's a great inspiration. And it took me a while to kind of sit there and think, well, if people hate it, that's fine, I've done it. but then people liked it. So you just got to get over that thing. If you decide not to, if your self-doubt gets too much, then you're never going to know. It's a safety bubble, but it's not necessarily a very good one, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Tell me about your creative process.
It kind of comes out of anywhere. So there's been, in terms of ideas, they come from anywhere. That question, where do you get your ideas, is kind of a, well, I mean, literally everywhere. I've had them from. I'm writing a novel at the moment, which initially started from a nightmare, and it was a weird nightmare. Like I woke up just thinking, what on earth? It was just, there were these two people escaping from one beach house to another one. But as they get to that beach house, they realize the people that are chasing them have found them, and these people had really like horrible glowing green eyes. And it took me ages to figure out how to spin that into a full novel, but that's where the genesis of that one came from. There was one that I wrote where I was watching a mother berate her child, and it really angered me the way she was doing it. There's other things, like I went on a stag weekend, bachelor party weekend away last year, and whilst we were doing our activities, I came up with the idea for a sequel to Summerside Lake Massacre. So literally, I could be walking down the street and something happens, and I'm like, "Oh, that'll be interesting." Or like you're in the news, you're in the news. Sorry, you're reading the news, and you hear something that just seems to that beggars belief, and you think, okay, well, that will sound even like that would sound absolutely ridiculous if it was in a short story. So why not put it in a short story? In terms of actually putting things down on paper, I've gotten into a habit now where when I'm writing, I try and do 1,000 words a day. I am working full time as well whilst I'm doing this, so most of the time it's when I'm on my lunch break. And then if I don't hit 1,000 words during my lunch break, I'll come home and try and finish them at home. I don't always hit that 1,000 words. And I think it's important that if you don't do that, if you don't finish it, don't kick yourself. Just be like, oh, okay, well, I've got 400 words today. That's 400 more than I had yesterday. And you just got to keep writing. The first draft of any story or novel is going to be bad. It's just getting it down on paper. And then the last thing, so I've got a book that's currently, like I said, we're just in the finishing of the editing process. And that I sent off to beta readers for the first time. And that I find invaluable. Yeah, that's a new part of the process. I think beta readers is invaluable. And I would even go so far as to say maybe that's like if you're not sure about an idea, bounce it off of someone else. Like if you're a painter and you're like, well, I'm thinking of doing this, but I don't know how to do this, and this, it might be worth speaking to someone else who may know how to do it or be able to advise you. It's, don't be precious about it. Embrace. I don't want to say, well, I do want to say criticism, because criticism doesn't mean it's bad. Like if it's constructive, criticism can be invaluable. So definitely part of the process there is to get other people's input at some part of the process.
Yeah, it's interesting that you've mentioned one of your books is being edited by your wife. How does collaboration play a role in your writing process, and what has it been like working with your spouse on your creative projects?
Well, that's been relatively recently. I didn't do it for, among other things, because I honestly didn't think she'd be interested. She's not a horror fan like I am, and some of the stories in that collection are quite unpleasant. So on a selfish level, I just thought, I don't want her to judge me. We're engaged. I don't want to suddenly call off the engagement. And she's read them since, and she was just like, "Oh, is that it?" So like some of the ideas that I have that I think are horrendous. Someone who's a non-horror fan just kind of went, "Oh, I've heard worse in the news," that sort of thing. But it came from, so Office Politics, bit of a segue. Office Politics was going to be in Among Other Things, and it just got too big. So I decided to release it as a separate thing. But I hadn't written anything that long yet. So I hadn't written Summerside Lake Massacre at that point. And I said to her, like it's effectively like the last half of it is an extended set piece, and I want to know whether it works. So she sat and read it, and while she was reading it, she just kind of she searched for a pen and then just started kind of like scribbling out and adding little notes and stuff like that. And I really valued her input so much. And she said, "Oh, that was really fun." Even to the point where she said, "No, this kill needs to be worse," or like this person's comeuppance needs to that's a bit disappointing, or you can't end this chapter there, you need to add a little bit more. And I found that part of the process really enjoyable as well. So when it came to Summerside Lake Massacre, it was a no-brainer. I was just turned to her and said, "Do you want to edit this one?" And she was like, "Yeah, that sounds great." It hasn't been as easy with this current one. Mainly because it's every chapter is a different character. I think that's probably the issue. Like there's no chapter numbers. It's the name of the person who's and a lot of them are quite short because it's it's a more straightforward thriller, and she hasn't not necessarily not enjoyed it. She's just found it more difficult, but that hasn't put her off. That's made her want to do it more. And I think just because we're that she may be my wife, she's also my best friend, and I would value that opinion from, my male best friend if he wanted to do something similar, whereby he'd be like, "Oh, I'd like to read that and give you some pointers." I wouldn't bat an eyelid, but I value Charlotte's opinion greatly, especially in something that I'd love to do. I mean, the dream would be to do this full time. So if she can have, and especially considering she doesn't like horror or suspense too much or anything too dark, it's really good getting almost an outsider's perspective on it, just to see if that works. So, yeah, no, it's good. It's good. I enjoy doing it.
So taking it back a little bit, can you share more about your early experiences with books that led you to fall in love with reading? Were there any particular books or authors that inspired you?
Yeah, so I read when I was younger. I mean, I love movies as much as I do novels, and so a lot of it's like my first kind of forays into reading with novelizations. I had like all the I had the first two Jurassic Park novelizations and stuff like that. And then there was a thing called point horror. Do you know about point horror at all? So it came over. It was huge in the US in the 80s, and it came over to the UK in the 90s. And it was just these tiny little skinny things, but it was almost like the gateway drug between Goosebumps and actual adult horror fiction. So I read loads of those when I was at school and when I was at primary school. But by the time I got to secondary school, by the time I got to high school, I don't know, I just kind of stopped reading much. And then when I was in my English language, when I was doing English language, one of the things was, pick a subject that you want to. It was almost like a small project. So pick a subject that you want to deal with, and we'll kind of like help you through this project. And it wasn't, in hindsight, it wasn't a very long project. It had to be like 2,000 words or something. But mine was going to be the difference on how fear was written in classic fiction compared to popular fiction. So my teacher recommended Dracula and anything by Stephen King. So I was like, okay. So I picked up Christine by Stephen King. And I oddly enough, I didn't like the book very much, and I still don't like the book very much. But I sat there and read half of it in one sitting. And that was when I was kind of like, oh, so this is why people read. And I was only 16 at the time. And so I just went through a phase where all I wanted to read was Stephen King. And then I realized that actually there's other authors out there that are like his contemporaries. So then I started reading things like Dean Koontz. And then there's a British author called James Herbert, who was quite big. And I started reading him as well. And it just blossomed from there. Like even my parents started sharing, like my dad at the time was a big fan of Tom Clancy. So I tried reading some of his. I was probably a bit too young to be reading something like Tom Clancy. But it just kind of like blossomed from there. So then it just kind of became a case of, every year I now have like I always have my face in a book. I literally have the new Stephen King one here ready to go once we're finished, So yeah, I mean, I genuinely can't get enough of it. And you know, like I've read bad books, I've read plenty of bad books, and you know, like that's fine. But there's, you know, like I think it's good to try different things. You know, I've even read Twilight, and that's not for me. But that's not to say it's not for other people. It's clearly quite popular, you know. So, um, yeah, no, that's kind of where that stems from.
I have a question. So when do you determine a book is bad? Do you read the whole thing, or is it just you stop once you've determined it?
It,
There's something that is a last straw. How do you determine?
it depends on the book. So using the example of Twilight, I finished the book and I didn't think it was that badly written. I think for, you know, it's a YA novel. Um, I was reading it in my late 20s. And, you know, I'm a man in my late 20s, you know, like it's clearly written for, sorry, my cat's going a bit mad. It's clearly written for, you know, an audience that is predominantly teenage girls. And I figured, you know, like I'll give it a go, you know, because I've read some young adult fiction, you know, like I'm a big fan of John Green. I think Looking for Alaska and Fault in Our Stars are absolutely fantastic. Um, and I finished it, and I thought, I think people criticizing the writing, you know, like I've read worse, certainly read worse writing. You know, James Patterson, I'm not a fan of his. I thought it was much better written than any James Patterson stuff. But I finished it. I gave it a go, and I just thought, yeah, I'm not going to bother reading the rest. It's not for me. On the flip side of that was I I as times have changed, as things have become more, you know, not necessarily progressive, but as the conversations about certain things in society are changing, it's very easy to then read a book that was maybe written in the 70s. And even though you can maybe say, okay, well, I get it that this was written in the 70s, sometimes you can't look past something like, so there was a Wilbur Smith book I read a little while ago, and the way he was describing the female characters in it, I was like, I know it was written in 1973, but I got 50 pages and I was like, I can't do that, you know.
Mhm.
That's it. That is more kind of, you know, my parents' generation can look at that and be relatively fine with it. But at the same time, I'm like, I don't mind there being caricatures, but the way he was describing the female characters, I was like, this is kind of gross. I don't like it.
Mhm.
And I've finished books literally only 50 pages from the end, and I'd just be like, I don't care how this goes, so I'll just throw it. I have no shame in that kind of thing.
So my next question is, self-publishing can be a unique and challenging journey. Could you tell us about your decision to self-publish your collection of short stories in 2020? What were the challenges and rewards of that experience?
I mean, the big challenge is you don't have, you know, until my wife took over, and you know, she's not a professional editor by any means of the, so you have to figure out a way of editing it yourself, proofreading. I mean, I love writing, but I'm a terrible speller. Even with having Microsoft Word, you know, it's still, you know, like instead of putting, you know, like, you know, like she saw a sign, it would, I might put, you know, like she saw a sigh, and you know, like, and I won't pick that up if I'm continuously reading it. So you always have to have someone who's prepared to, you have to find someone who's prepared to edit it, preferably for free, because I didn't have any money when I was doing, you know, not that sort of money. And be prepared not to be too precious about it, because some of the reviews that I've got for all of my books, some of the reviews are incredibly petty. And the first time it happened, I did take it quite bad. I was like kind of like stomping around, going, "What are they?" You know, before I realised that, you know, there's some Stephen King books out there that I've loathed, and I'm sure if I said to him, "Hey man, your book's rubbish," he wouldn't be very happy about it. But you know, that's part of the course. But you also got to think of the covers. It's every aspect of it. You don't have a cover designer, you don't have an editor, you don't have proofreaders, professional proofreaders. You've got to do all of that yourself. The formatting you have to do as well, which took some time. I realized that uploading a PDF document was far easier than uploading a Word document, because a Word document, the formatting starts to go a bit mad. And this was all a learning curve. I mean, going back to, among other things, it went through, I published it, and then I realized there was a spelling mistake on the back of the cover on the blurb. So I then had to change that, but that meant changing the cover as well. And then I had to upload that, and then the formatting was all wrong. And then I discovered a font I would have preferred to have done it, so I re-uploaded it with the new font. And it's taken up to Summerside Lake Massacre to really feel like I've found the groove. And you just have to be patient with it. You have to be prepared to. It sounds, like it sounds really pretentious, and but you do have to put the work in. You have to make sure, like, just because you finished writing a book, you need to be able to go through all of those processes yourself. You're not just handing it off to someone else and they'll be able to do it in the same way as a traditional publishing house is. So it is challenging, and there's been many times where someone has pointed out on social media, hey mate, there's a pretty glaring spelling error on this page. And for the most part, I've just kind of left it, because once it's out there, I'm moving on to something else. And and that happens in professional ones as well. I've found like 3 or 4 spelling mistakes in this new Stephen King book, and frankly, it doesn't faze me. If people do get bothered by that whilst they're reading, then fair play to them. But yeah, self-publishing has been its own journey. But I also, on the flip side of that, really like the full creative control. I like the for better and for worse, self-publishing for authors is pure raw writing. You don't, because you don't have a whole load of a team of people behind you making sure it's going to be the greatest thing in the world. It means that you can find other self-published people that their writing is very pure, very raw. It doesn't necessarily work, but it means that anybody can be creative in that space. And let's be honest, like, traditional publishing is a business. They need to know what sells, and what indie publishing does, it allows people that would, that could particularly fit a niche market. They're able to get their stuff out of there for people to, to read. So.
Mm-hmm. So how do you handle bad reviews? And also, do you have a process for getting reviews in general?
In terms of how I handle them, I've certainly gotten a lot better at it. There was one for Summerside Lake Massacre, and it was on Goodreads, and the guy was ruthless. Like, he highlighted all the things he didn't like, and there were things that I'd missed. I'm not American. I forget that we call the big articulated trucks, we call them lorries. So I named a truck a lorry in Summerside Lake Massacre. Now it's set in the American Northwest, so obviously that's a really glaring error. And as soon as he pointed that out, I was like, oh. But at the same time, I messaged him saying, some of this is actually very constructive, and he was quite apologetic afterwards. I don't think he was expecting me to message him. And he said, "Oh no, like, I could give it another score." And I just said, "Don't you dare. Like, if this is if this is a 2.5, no, if this is like a 2 out of 5 book for you, then that's a 2.5 of 5, 2.5 out of 5 book for you. It's not, it's not Ulysses, it's not War and Peace, it's a slasher novel. If you didn't enjoy it, that's absolutely fine. It's not going to be marketed for everybody." So I've become a lot more relaxed since the first bad reviews, where I was like a child throwing a tantrum, really. Sorry, what was the second part of the question? I'm rambling.
Do you have a process for getting reviews in general?
No, not really a process. Since I've started doing it, there's been people that I've been, like, I get, I send my work off for beta readers, but I beta read for these people as well. And our big thing is to be honest with each other. So there's an author who's just released her first book. Her name's Casey Masterson, and we get on terrifically well. We get on very, very well. She's based in New Jersey, I believe. And I've told them all, just be honest. If it's not your kind of thing, if you want to leave a review for it, do that. And she's never, Casey has never gone to the point where she's she feels obliged to give a glowing review. Her reviews are generally quite good, but they're also quite critical where they need to be. And I can only ask for that kind of thing. I don't do any of that stuff where it's, sometimes people message you going, let's work together. Like if you pay me this amount of money, I can get thousands of people to, do reviews for you. I'm always a bit skeptical about those sorts of things. I don't feel the need to be paying money to people just to get good reviews for my books. If the book isn't good, I would rather get bad reviews for it. I'd rather learn from that experience and move on. So in terms of reviews, the people who beta read my stuff, they're good at doing reviews, and I review theirs when they come out as well. But apart from that, I just let it, go out to pasture and see what happens. I found that actually that the Goodreads people are very, very harsh in their criticisms. They're much more aggressive. But on Amazon, it's much more just kind of, oh, this was nice, this was a good read, and then it's almost like, like you've got your mum doing the cooking is the Amazon, and then it's Gordon Ramsay over at Goodreads being hyper critical. That's the way I look at it.
Do you have a process for marketing?
Just social media, really, and trying to find people in a similar vein. That's how I found your social media, actually, because it was, I think it was a creative thing, and then obviously the mental health advocacy on your side of things as well is something that struck a chord. I've had my own dealings with mental health in the past, and that kind of networking, I think, is very, very good. I believe as well not to do it. It's difficult to explain. It's kind of like for social media, I'll on Twitter, I'll just use hashtags like shameless self-promotion hashtag or writing community hashtag, that sort of thing. But I make sure that regardless of what I'm posting, I try and post it on everything, including Facebook. And like Facebook is just my family, but even if it's just my family, really, I'd rather be consistent. I'm on Twitter, I'm on Threads, I'm on Instagram, I'm on Blue Sky now. That's another Twitter variant. I refuse to call it X because it's a stupid name. But yeah, in terms of marketing, that's really where it goes. There are places that I've seen that, again, you can pay to do it, but unfortunately life gets in the way. I just spent just over £500 on my car. That is £500 I could have spent, on marketing, but frankly, I don't want to be driving a death trap. So the car comes first. So marketing is just a slow drip process. And any successful marketing has kind of come around from networking on social media.
You've already published several books and have more in development. Can you give us a sneak peek into the themes or ideas you explore in your upcoming works?
So the next one is the one, it should hopefully be out around October. It's been delayed. It was supposed to be out in July, but I got married, things got in the way. Life got in the way again. So that one's called On the Moor. It's the first one that's set in the UK. It's set up in the Yorkshire Moors. We've got a place called the Yorkshire National Park. And it's about two ladies that are, well, I say ladies, they're university students, and it's a year since something has happened to one of them. And they're going to go away to a nice little fishing village in the middle of on the Yorkshire coast. But whilst that's happening, they get kidnapped. It turns out the boyfriend of one of them is not. This is all in the blurb. I'm not spoiling it. I'm not spoiling anything. They get kidnapped, but when they're able to escape, they are in the middle of the Yorkshire Moors, which is a huge place. Think something like Yellowstone, but more brown and grey and miserable. And so they've got to try and survive out on the moor whilst their assailants are in pursuit. So it's more of a straightforward suspense novel. And then the one I'm currently writing is called The Eyeless, and that's the one that is based on that dream of the people with the glowing eyes.
Mhm.
I don't want to say too much about that one,
You
just
don't have
because
to.
it's one of those ones where like the reveals. It's one of those ones where it starts off as something small. In short, it will be in the blurb. A supernatural thing is happening and is very fictional. I set a lot of my stuff in the Pacific Northwest. I don't know why. It's more just kind of I like the kind of like Summerside Lake Massacre is set. It's a fictional place called Summerside Hills, but it's in Washington State. And The Eyeless is set in a place called Rockford Sound, which is completely fictitious. It's not far off the Canadian border in Washington State. And something supernatural happens that causes people within the periphery of this supernatural entity to go mad. But that's the start. It kind of I know where it's going and I know how it's going to end, but let's just say that it's one of those things that's in constant freefall where it starts off as something and then it becomes something else and it becomes something else. And then after that I've got a whole load of other stuff that I've got planned. I might write something shorter, like a small novella. I've got one about haunted cinema called The House is Dark, which I've got planned out as well, which I might write, but that's going to be a skinny little thing. But that's what I've got on at the moment.
So I did read some of your blurbs, and I just want to know, what's the secret to writing a good suspenseful blurb?
Oh God! Oh, now I feel anxious because you actually... Oh dear. I don't know. It's almost like I tend to revise them quite a lot. The one for Summerside Lake Massacre said far too much, and I figured it would just be, like, I'm a big fan of slashers and I like 80s set ones, and I can't remember what I was watching. I think it may have been there's a series of documentaries on Shudder called It Comes in Darkness or something along those lines, and it's about 80s horror, and they showed the trailer for a film called Sleepaway Camp, and it was very, very brief and basically just said, like, it's a very picturesque place, but something has happened. And I just thought, oh well, that's basically where I would go with that, because there is a central mystery to Summerside Lake Massacre, so I didn't want to reveal too much. Just say that there is something that's being hidden and someone knows about it, and there's going to be lots of blood, basically, because it's almost like, sorry to keep rambling, it's one of those things where a good blurb is almost like you're setting up the first act, and don't say anything. I think it's probably the best thing to do is say that you're condensing the first act into a couple of paragraphs and then leave it at that, and leave it on a cliffhanger as well, so people want to know more.
That's awesome. What advice would you give to an aspiring author, especially those who are considering self-publishing or in the early stages of their writing careers?
I'm going to steal some quotes from some other authors. So there's the Stephen King one, read a lot and write a lot, and I cannot stress that enough. To say, if you're wanting to write fantasy, that's fine, but make sure you read as much fantasy as you don't stick to one author. You'll start replicating their style. So, like, if you want to be the next Brandon Sanderson, that's fine, but read Brandon Sanderson, read Sarah J. Maas, read Robin Hobb, read everybody. And then at the same time, write, even if it's not like you're not sure about writing a novel, maybe just do even like a few writing exercises in the week, and you can kind of like start to get your physical style, your own writing style. And then, to quote Neil Gaiman as well, he said, writing is all about putting one word in front of the other. It's that easy and it's that hard. And sometimes it flows like you wouldn't believe, and you get really excited about it. But currently with The Eyeless, I'm having a little break just to write some shorts, because it's not so much that I've got writer's block. I know exactly where it's going to go, but the bit I'm writing at the moment is, there's a stop in the action and we've got a bit of a flashback scene going on, and I'm finding that incredibly difficult to write at the moment. So rather than kind of stop and lose momentum, I've moved on to something else. So it can be difficult. Don't be disheartened. You're not going to be inspired every day to write. But also on those uninspired days, sometimes that's when the best writing happens. But you just got to keep doing it. The book, ultimately, the book's not going to write itself, or the story's not going to write itself. So you just have to. And if you're self-publishing, just remember you're not on any deadline. You haven't got, like if you do a self-imposed deadline, for me, that's the worst thing that I could have ever done. Was I was like, that was Summerside Lake Massacre. I said, it's got to come out on this date in the middle of the summer. And that created, way too much unnecessary stress. So don't do that. Go by your own timetable and don't stress yourself out.
That's awesome. So a little bit about you. You're a keen gamer, into fitness, a fan of rock music, and you play the guitar. So for your fans of your work, what's one thing you'd like them to know about you that they might not find in your books or author bio?
It's a good question. I can do with some favorites. My favorite film flits between Jurassic Park, the original Jurassic Park, because I'm old enough to have seen that in the cinema. So that was an experience. But it's either that or Magnolia, which is a film in 1999. It's a bit difficult to explain. It's just a whole bunch of characters and how they interact in Los Angeles over the course of 24 hours. It's probably most famous for having Tom Cruise in it playing this horrendous sex guru who's not too far removed from someone like Andrew Tate, which is very interesting seeing Tom Cruise playing someone like that. My favorite band is Tool. Absolutely love Tool. But my favorite album is Master of Puppets by Metallica. Rock music is something that's been part of me for a long time. My dad made me grow up on things like Pink Floyd and Genesis and Led Zeppelin and that sort of stuff. So rock music's always been a big thing. I don't know. What else? I'm not very good at talking about myself, as it were. Is there anything you would like to know, Katie?
Yeah. You say you try to hit 1,000 words a day. So how do you set goals as a writer? And also, how do you course correct if you notice you haven't been meeting your goals in like a few days?
There's an element of shifting the goalposts. So if I don't hit that, just because, like I say, life gets in the way, it'd be far easier if I was doing it full time, because then obviously I wouldn't have anything else to worry about. I think for me, it was telling myself that I don't have to write to any time frame. And that's not an excuse to be lazy. You've still got to have the discipline to put it down. But in terms of course correcting, I just tell myself the worst that's happened is I've lost a couple of days, or I've lost momentum in something. And it was something that my wife used to say, because when I met my wife, I met her 9 years ago, and I was not in a good place. And she was the one who kind of told me that to look at the whole thing of what's the worst that can happen, what's the worst that's going to happen. And I'm still sensitive to certain things like that, and that wasn't her being heartless. That was her being kind of a realist. I kind of needed that. I'd sunken into my own kind of this horrible pit of melancholy. So I do just say to myself, rather than going, oh, damn it, I've missed my target this week, and everything like that. If that happens, I just go, okay, I'll just write next week. And I won't try and catch up either, because that just adds more stress. So it's just like, I didn't write 5,000 words this week. I wrote only 3, which means I'm going to have to write 7 next week. That's not, if that's how you work, that's fine. That's absolutely fine. For me, that just adds more stress. And like I say, I'm not writing to any timetable, so I'm not too worried about it.
Amazing. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
That's okay. Sorry about all the rambling. When I get started, it's difficult to stop.
It was great. Thank you so much.
No, thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.